Captain David Chen had perfected the art of quiet mornings aboard Frontier Station Omega-7, a routine that involved synthetic coffee that almost tasted real, status reports that rarely contained surprises, and the kind of peaceful administrative work that let him forget he'd ever been involved in anything more exciting than scheduling cargo transfers. 5 years of managing a remote way station in neutral space had given him exactly the anonymous, comfortable life he'd wanted after his divorce, right up until his communications officer's voice shattered the morning calm with words that made his coffee cup freeze halfway to his lips. "Captain, we have multiple contacts dropping out of hyperspace. Massive signatures." "Sir, I'm reading, holy shit, that's a Zentauran battle fleet." David set down his coffee very carefully, his brain trying to process information that didn't belong in his quiet corner of the galaxy. "How many ships, Lieutenant?" 47 vessels, sir. Including 3 dreadnoughts and what looks like a command carrier that's. Captain, that thing's bigger than most space stations. Lieutenant Morrison's voice carried the kind of professional calm that came from years of experience, but David could hear the underlying tension. "They're requesting permission to dock, sir. Priority diplomatic clearance." Diplomatic clearance? David moved to the main display, watching as the Zentauran fleet materialized from the swirling energy patterns of hyperspace exit. The ships were beautiful in the way that all Zentauran technology managed to be, organic curves that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns, hulls that seemed to breathe like living creatures, and weapon systems that looked more like art installations than instruments of destruction. What would the Zentauran Confederacy want with a frontier trading post? "Sir," Morrison's voice took on the careful tone of someone delivering news they knew their captain wouldn't want to hear, "they're asking for you specifically. By name." David felt his stomach perform what could only be described as a tactical retreat toward his boots. In 5 years of running Omega-7, he'd dealt with smugglers, pirates, refugees from 3 different civil wars, and a memorably drunk Regellian ambassador who'd tried to declare the men's restroom a sovereign embassy. None of those situations had prepared him for the possibility that his past might literally arrive with enough firepower to sterilize a solar system. "Did they specify which name?" David asked, though he was already dreading the answer. Captain David Chen, former strategic advisor to the Zentauran Military Exchange Program, currently administrator of Frontier Station Omega-7. Morrison paused. "Sir, they also transmitted what appears to be a personal message. It's marked for your eyes only." David closed his eyes, feeling the comfortable routine of his morning dissolve into the kind of cosmic irony that made him wonder if the universe had a particularly twisted sense of humor. The strategic advisor position had been his first real job after graduating from the Interspecies Relations Academy, and he'd held it for exactly 18 months before his marriage fell apart. His wife left him for her military career, and he'd requested the most remote assignment available to put as much distance as possible between himself and anything resembling his former life. "Transfer the message to my private terminal," David said. "And Morrison? Keep this quiet until I figure out what's going on." The personal message was brief, formal, and signed with a name that made David feel like he was reading his own obituary. "Supreme Commander Lyaria Nalthara of the Zentauran Confederacy requests immediate audience with Captain David Chen regarding matters of mutual strategic importance. Diplomatic immunity and safe conduct guaranteed." Below the official text, in smaller font that somehow managed to convey both authority and uncertainty, was a single additional line, "We need to talk." L. David stared at the message for several minutes, trying to reconcile the formal military language with memories of quiet breakfast conversations and the woman who used to steal his coffee when she thought he wasn't looking. Lyaria had been Lieutenant Lyaria Nalthara when they'd met, an ambitious young officer assigned to the cultural exchange program who'd possessed more raw determination than actual experience. She'd also been his wife for 3 tumultuous years before deciding that their relationship was holding her back from her true potential. Apparently, her true potential had been Supreme Commander of the entire Zentauran Confederacy. "Morrison," David called through the intercom, "what's the current political status of the Zentauran Confederacy?" "Sir, they've unified most of the aquatic species in this sector under a single government. Major military power, controls about 40 systems, and they've been expanding their influence through a combination of diplomatic pressure and, well, sir, they've got the biggest navy anyone's seen since the core worlds unified. David rubbed his temples, trying to process the implications. When he'd known Lyaria, the Zentaurans had been a loose confederation of city-states that spent most of their energy arguing among themselves. The idea that they'd become a unified military power was shocking enough without adding the personal complications of his ex-wife being their supreme leader. And their supreme commander? Lyaria and Aelthera. Rose through the ranks incredibly fast, unified the Confederation through a series of brilliant military and diplomatic campaigns. She's, well, sir, the intelligence reports describe her as one of the most effective leaders in known space. Morrison paused. Sir, should I ask how you know her? It's complicated, Lieutenant. David looked out at the Zentauran fleet, noting the way the ships held perfect formation while maintaining enough distance to avoid appearing threatening. Professional, competent, and absolutely overwhelming, exactly the kind of power projection that Lyaria would have designed if she'd been given command of a space fleet. Grant them docking permission for the command vessel only. Full diplomatic protocols, but I want security on standby. Yes, sir. And Captain? What should I tell the crew about why a Zentauran Supreme Commander is asking for our station administrator by name? David considered several possible explanations, none of which would make the situation any less awkward. Tell them it's classified pending further briefing. And Morrison? When the Supreme Commander boards, treat this as a formal diplomatic visit. Full honors, proper protocols, and absolutely no mention of any personal connections. Personal connections, sir. Lieutenant, has anyone ever told you that curiosity killed the communications officer? No, sir, but I've heard rumors about what happens to communications officers who ask too many questions. David managed a smile despite his growing anxiety. Smart man. Carry on. As the Zentauran command vessel approached the station's docking bay, David tried to prepare himself for seeing Lyaria again. 5 years was a long time, but apparently not long enough to conquer a significant portion of the galaxy and completely transform yourself from an ambitious junior officer into the most powerful military leader in 3 sectors. The question that kept nagging at him was why she'd come here at all. Omega-7 was strategically unimportant, economically marginal, and politically insignificant. If Lyaria wanted to meet with human representatives, there were proper diplomatic channels that didn't require bringing a battle fleet to a frontier trading post. Unless, David realized with growing unease, this wasn't entirely about diplomacy. He changed into his dress uniform, checked his reflection in the mirror, and tried to convince himself that he was preparing for a routine diplomatic meeting rather than a reunion with the woman whose departure had convinced him to exile himself to the edge of known space. The irony that she'd apparently spent the same 5 years building an empire while he'd been trying to disappear wasn't lost on him. As the docking bay's arrival indicators activated, David made his way through the station's corridors, noting how his crew moved with the kind of nervous energy that came from suddenly finding their quiet posting transformed into the center of galactic attention. Whatever Lyaria wanted, her arrival had already changed everything about his carefully constructed peaceful existence. The docking bay doors sealed with their usual pneumatic hiss, and David found himself standing alone in the reception area, waiting for his ex-wife to arrive with an honor guard that probably outranked every human officer in this sector of space. Morrison, he said into his communicator, how long since you've updated our insurance policies? Sir. Never mind, Lieutenant. I have a feeling we're about to find out whether diplomatic immunity covers emotional damages. The airlock cycled open, and David straightened his shoulders, trying to look like someone who regularly negotiated with supreme commanders rather than someone whose biggest recent challenge had been mediating a dispute between Regellian traders and a particularly stubborn automated customs system. Whatever happened next, he was fairly certain it was going to be more interesting than his morning coffee routine. The woman who emerged from the Zentauran command vessel's airlock bore only superficial resemblance to the eager young Lieutenant David had once been married to. Lyaria and Aelthera now moved with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to having entire star systems hang on her every decision, her formal military regalia incorporating design elements from dozens of aquatic species that had unified under her leadership. She still appeared essentially human aside from her pointed ears and the subtle gill slits along her neck, but 5 years of supreme command had transformed her from someone who asked for permission into someone who expected the universe to accommodate her presence. Behind her walked an honor guard that made David acutely aware of how thoroughly outclassed his frontier station security team would be in any conceivable conflict. The Zentauran officers moved with synchronized precision, their bioadaptive armor shifting colors to match their surroundings while sensor arrays built into their equipment scanned everything within range. David found himself being analyzed by technology that probably cost more than his station's annual budget. "Captain Chen," Lyaria said, her voice carrying the harmonics that marked Zentauran vocal modification, a sign that she'd undergone the biological alterations necessary to communicate directly with aquatic species through subsonic frequencies. "Thank you for granting us docking privileges." "Supreme Commander N-Elthara," David replied, managing to keep his voice steady despite the surreal nature of addressing his ex-wife with formal military titles. "Welcome to Frontier Station Omega-7. I trust your journey was uneventful." "Quite efficient, thank you." Lyaria's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but David caught a flicker of something that might have been amusement at his careful formality. "I wonder if we might speak privately. I have matters to discuss that require discretion." David gestured toward the conference room he'd hastily prepared for diplomatic meetings, trying not to think about the last time he'd been alone with Lyaria. That conversation had ended with divorce papers and his request for assignment to the furthest possible edge of human space. This one was taking place while she commanded enough military hardware to conquer 3 sectors. "Of course. If you'll follow me." David led the way through corridors that suddenly felt inadequate for hosting someone of Lyaria's current status. "I should mention that this station operates under neutral territory protocols. All visitors are guaranteed safe passage and diplomatic immunity." "I'm aware of Omega-7's status," Lyaria replied, her tone carrying implications that David wasn't sure he wanted to explore. "It's one of the reasons I chose to meet here." They settled into the conference room's modest furniture, Lyaria's honor guard taking positions outside while David activated the privacy screens that would prevent electronic surveillance. For a moment, they sat in silence, 5 years of history filling the space between them with unspoken questions and carefully buried emotions. "You look well," Lyaria said finally. "Station administration seems to suit you." "It's quiet," David replied. "Which was exactly what I wanted after everything fell apart." "David." Lyaria leaned forward slightly, her formal composure softening for the first time since her arrival. "I know this is awkward, but I need your help. The situation in this sector is more complex than your government realizes, and you're the only person who might be able to prevent a war that could devastate both our peoples." David felt his stomach perform another tactical maneuver. "What kind of war?" "Human colonies have been expanding into territories that the Zentauran Confederacy considers strategically vital. Your government views this as routine settlement of uninhabited systems. My people see it as encroachment that threatens our defensive perimeter." Lyaria activated a holographic display that showed stellar maps with overlapping territorial claims. 3 incidents in the past 6 months have nearly triggered military responses from both sides. "And you're telling me this because?" "Because the strategies I've used to unify the Zentauran Confederacy were based on the conflict resolution theories you taught me during our marriage." Lyaria's admission carried a weight that made David feel like the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. "Every major diplomatic breakthrough I've achieved has been built on principles you explained during our breakfast conversations." David stared at her, trying to process the implications. "Are you saying that you've conquered half the galaxy using marriage counseling techniques?" "I'm saying that your insights into cross-cultural psychology and strategic compromise have proven remarkably effective when applied to interspecies diplomacy." Lyaria's smile was rueful. "The irony that I've spent 5 years building an empire with methods I learned from the relationship I destroyed isn't lost on me." "Lyaria." David rubbed his forehead, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. Why are you really here? If you need diplomatic consultation, there are proper channels. You don't bring a battle fleet to discuss territorial disputes. I'm here because the human diplomatic corps doesn't trust the Zentauran Confederacy, my military council doesn't trust human expansion patterns, and we're approximately 6 weeks away from incidents that could escalate into full-scale war. Lyaria's expression grew serious. I'm also here because I've spent 5 years proving to myself that I was capable of achieving the ambitions that drove me away from our marriage, and I've discovered that none of it feels meaningful without someone to share it with. David felt like he'd been hit by a diplomatic transport. You're asking me to help prevent interstellar war, and also asking me out on a date. I'm asking you to consider that the woman who left you to pursue her military career has succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, and that success has taught her what she actually valued about the relationship she abandoned. Lyaria looked directly at him with the kind of intensity that had once made him feel like the most important person in the galaxy. David, I didn't just come here for political consultation. I came here because I've missed you every day for 5 years, and building an empire has felt hollow without you to tell me whether I'm making the right decisions. David stood up and walked to the conference room's observation window, looking out at the Zentauran battle fleet that represented the culmination of everything Lyaria had achieved since leaving their marriage. The ships were beautiful, powerful, and absolutely terrifying in their implications for regional balance of power. You left me, David said quietly. You said our relationship was holding you back from your potential. I was wrong. Lyaria's voice carried harmonics that suggested deep emotional resonance. My potential wasn't about commanding fleets or conquering territory. It was about becoming someone worthy of the partnership we could have built together. And now you want to try again? While you're supreme commander of a military confederation and I'm running a frontier trading post. I want to try again because I'm supreme commander of a military confederation and you're the person who taught me that real strength comes from knowing when to compromise rather than when to fight. Lyaria stood and moved beside him at the window. David, the territorial disputes aren't the real issue. The real issue is that human and Zentauran expansion philosophies are fundamentally incompatible, and unless someone finds a way to bridge that gap, we're going to end up in a war that destroys everything both our species have built. David looked at her reflection in the observation window, noting the way command responsibility had changed her posture and expression while leaving unchanged the determined intelligence that had originally attracted him to her. And you think I can help solve that? I think you're the only person who understands both human and Zentauran strategic psychology well enough to find compromise solutions that neither side would accept from their own negotiators. Lyaria turned to face him directly. I also think that working together again might help us figure out whether what we had was worth rebuilding, or whether we're both just nostalgic for something that was never as good as we remember. David considered the implications while watching her fleet maintain perfect formation outside his station. The personal and political aspects of her proposal were so entangled that he couldn't evaluate them separately, which was probably intentional on Lyaria's part. If I agree to help, David said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? Officially, you'd serve as a special advisor to the Zentauran Confederacy with full diplomatic status and access to classified strategic information. Unofficially, Lyaria's smile carried hints of the woman he'd once known beneath the Supreme Commander's authority. We'd spend enough time working together to figure out whether the people we've become are compatible with the people we used to be. David looked out at the battle fleet, then back at Lyaria, trying to balance the personal risks against the potential consequences of interstellar war. And if we can't prevent this conflict, then at least we'll have tried to save both our peoples from a devastating war. Lyaria moved closer, her presence filling his awareness with the kind of magnetic attraction that had originally drawn them together. And if we can prevent it, then I suppose we'll have proven that some partnerships are worth rebuilding, David replied, realizing that his decision had been made the moment she'd walked through his airlock. Is that a yes, Captain Chen? David looked at his ex-wife, who had somehow become the most powerful military leader in 3 sectors while he'd been trying to hide from their shared past, and realized that the universe's sense of irony was even more twisted than he'd originally suspected. That's a yes, Supreme Commander Eneelthara, he said. But I'm keeping my own quarters, and we're establishing clear professional boundaries. Agreed, Lyaria replied, though her smile suggested she had her own ideas about how long those boundaries might last. As they began planning their approach to preventing interstellar war, David couldn't help but reflect on how thoroughly his quiet morning routine had been disrupted by the arrival of his ex-wife and her army. Still, he had to admit that impending galactic conflict was considerably more interesting than scheduling cargo transfers. Even if it did complicate his coffee schedule considerably. David's attempt to maintain professional boundaries with his ex-wife became considerably more complicated when Ambassador Patricia Wells arrived aboard the human diplomatic vessel Concordia, bringing with her enough suspicion about Zentauran military intentions to power a small paranoia generator. The ambassador was a career diplomat with the kind of rigid adherence to protocol that made every conversation feel like a formal treaty negotiation, and her first question upon boarding Omega-7 was why their remote frontier station had suddenly become the center of interstellar attention. Captain Chen, Ambassador Wells said as they met in the station's formal reception area, "I need a full briefing on your interactions with the Zentauran Supreme Commander. The presence of a battle fleet in neutral territory has raised significant concerns among the Colonial Defense Council." David found himself in the uniquely awkward position of trying to explain his relationship with Lyaria without revealing personal details that could compromise either his credibility or the delicate diplomatic situation they were trying to resolve. "Ambassador, Supreme Commander Lyaria has requested assistance with territorial disputes that could potentially escalate into armed conflict. We're working to find mutually acceptable solutions." Ambassador Wells's tone suggested that David's use of the collective pronoun had not gone unnoticed. "Captain, what exactly is your relationship with the Zentauran leadership?" Before David could formulate a response that was both honest and professionally appropriate, Lyaria entered the reception area with the fluid grace that made even routine movements seem like choreographed performances. She'd changed from her formal military regalia into diplomatic attire that managed to be both respectful and subtly intimidating, a combination that David recognized as classic Lyarian tactical psychology. "Ambassador Wells," Lyaria said, extending a greeting that followed perfect human diplomatic protocol. "I am Lyaria Lyaria, Supreme Commander of the Zentauran Confederacy. Thank you for responding to our request for diplomatic consultation so quickly." "Supreme Commander," Wells replied, her tone carefully neutral. "I understand you have concerns about human colonial expansion in this sector." "Not concerns, opportunities for cooperative development that could benefit both our peoples." Lyaria activated a holographic display showing territorial maps with proposed settlement patterns. "The issue isn't competition for resources, but incompatible expansion philosophies that are creating unnecessary friction." David watched the two women begin their diplomatic dance, noting how Lyaria's negotiating style had evolved since their marriage. She still used the psychological insights he'd taught her, but she'd refined them into something approaching art. Every gesture, every pause, every inflection was designed to guide her counterpart toward conclusions that served Zentauran interests while appearing to offer genuine compromise. "What kind of expansion philosophies?" Wells asked. "Human colonies tend to establish isolated settlements that maximize individual autonomy and resource extraction efficiency. Zentauran communities prefer integrated development networks that maintain ecological balance and collective decision-making structures." Lyaria highlighted areas where the two approaches were creating conflicts. "Neither philosophy is inherently superior, but they're creating incompatible territorial patterns." David realized he was watching Lyaria implement strategies they developed together during late-night conversations about conflict resolution, scaled up from marital disputes to interstellar politics. The recognition that she'd taken their personal problem-solving techniques and used them to build an empire was both flattering and deeply unsettling. "Ambassador," David interjected, "the Supreme Commander's analysis aligns with our own intelligence reports. The territorial disputes aren't about resources, they're about fundamentally different approaches to community organization." Wells turned to him with the kind of sharp attention that made David feel like he was being examined under a microscope. "Captain, how familiar are you with Zentauran strategic doctrine?" I served as strategic advisor to the Zentauran military exchange program for 18 months, David replied, technically true if incomplete. My role involved analyzing compatibility between human and Zentauran operational methods. I see. Wells's tone suggested she suspected there was more to the story. And you believe their current expansion patterns are compatible with human colonial interests? David glanced at Lyaria, who was watching their exchange with the kind of focused attention she'd once applied to breakfast conversation and now apparently used for galactic politics. I believe both sides want the same things: secure territories, thriving communities, and peaceful coexistence. The conflicts arise from misunderstanding each other's methods. David has an exceptional understanding of cross-cultural psychology, Lyaria added, using his first name with casual familiarity that made Ambassador Wells's eyebrows rise slightly. His insights have been invaluable in developing integration strategies that accommodate both human and Zentauran needs. Wells looked between them with growing suspicion. How long have you two been working together on these integration strategies? The question hung in the air like an unexploded diplomatic torpedo. David felt Lyaria's gaze on him, waiting to see how he would handle the personal revelation that could either strengthen their negotiating position or completely undermine their credibility. The Supreme Commander and I have a professional history, David said carefully. We've collaborated on strategic analysis in the past. Professional history, Wells repeated. Captain, I think I need a more detailed briefing on your background with Zentauran leadership. Before David could respond, his communications officer's voice crackled through the intercom with news that transformed personal awkwardness into genuine crisis. Captain, we're receiving priority alerts from Colonial Defense. 3 more alien fleets have entered this sector, and they're all requesting diplomatic conferences. Sir, everyone wants to talk to you specifically. David felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. How many ships total, Morrison? Approximately 200 vessels, sir. We've got Rigelian heavy cruisers, Andromedan battle groups, and what looks like a Draconian war fleet. Captain, every major power in 3 sectors is converging on our position. Lyaria's expression shifted from diplomatic calm to strategic alertness. David, this isn't about territorial disputes anymore. Someone's leaked information about our negotiations, and every species with expansion interests is trying to position themselves for whatever agreement we reach. What agreement? Wells demanded. Captain Chen, what exactly have you been negotiating with the Zentauran Confederacy? David realized that his quiet attempt to help prevent a small-scale conflict had somehow escalated into the most significant diplomatic gathering in recent galactic history. Ambassador, I think we may have accidentally triggered a general conference on interstellar territorial rights. You think you may have triggered what? It appears, Lyaria said with the kind of calm authority that made David remember why he'd once found her so attractive and so infuriating, that our private diplomatic consultation has been interpreted as the foundation for new territorial accords. Every species in the region is arriving to ensure their interests are represented. Wells stared at them both. Are you telling me that a frontier station administrator and the supreme commander of the Zentauran Confederacy have accidentally convened the largest diplomatic gathering since the Galactic Accords? That would be an accurate assessment, David replied weakly. And you two have been conducting these negotiations based on your professional history? David looked at Lyaria, who was trying not to smile at the absurdity of their situation. Ambassador, it's complicated. I'm beginning to suspect that's an understatement, Captain. Wells activated her own communications device. I need to contact Colonial Command immediately. This situation is far beyond my authorization level. As Ambassador Wells began making urgent calls to human leadership, David found himself alone with Lyaria for the first time since her arrival. Did you know this would happen? He asked. I hoped our negotiations might attract attention from other species, but I didn't anticipate quite this level of enthusiasm. Lyaria's smile carried hints of the strategic mischief he remembered from their marriage. Though I have to admit, having every major power in the region come to us for territorial negotiations does strengthen our position considerably. Our position? David, we're about to become the de facto mediators for the most significant interstellar territorial dispute in decades. Every species that arrives will want to negotiate with the team that apparently solved human Zentauran expansion conflicts. Lyaria moved closer, her presence filling his awareness with familiar warmth. This could be the opportunity to establish lasting peace in the entire sector. David considered the implications while listening to Ambassador Wells's increasingly urgent communications with Colonial Command. And personally, I think the universe is giving us a second chance to build something together that's bigger than either of us could achieve alone. Lyaria's voice carried harmonics that suggested deep emotional resonance. The question is whether we're both ready to take it. Through the observation windows, David could see the growing collection of alien fleets taking positions around Omega-7, transforming his quiet frontier station into the most diplomatically significant location in 3 sectors. The personal and political implications of his reunion with Lyaria had become so entangled that he could no longer separate them. "All right," David said, making a decision that would change the course of his life for the second time in 5 years. "Let's prevent some wars and see where that leads us." Lyaria's smile was radiant with the kind of shared purpose that had originally brought them together. Together, David confirmed, realizing that his ex-wife's army had brought him not just the possibility of renewed romance, but the chance to participate in the kind of galactic diplomacy he'd never imagined possible. As the first delegations began requesting docking clearance, David couldn't help but reflect that his morning coffee routine was definitely going to require some major adjustments. 6 months after accidentally convening the largest diplomatic gathering since the formation of the Galactic Council, David stood on the observation deck of Lyaria's flagship, watching the final signatures being added to what historians were already calling the Omega Accords. The agreement had established new frameworks for interstellar territorial development that accommodated the expansion needs of 14 different species while maintaining ecological and cultural preservation standards that satisfied even the most environmentally conscious delegations. The Andromedan ambassador just confirmed ratification by their High Senate, Lyaria reported, consulting the diplomatic status board that tracked approvals across dozens of governments. That makes it unanimous. Every signatory species has now officially adopted the new territorial protocols. David nodded, still somewhat amazed that his attempt to help his ex-wife prevent a small-scale conflict had evolved into a comprehensive restructuring of interspecies relations across 3 sectors. And the implementation timeline? Phased rollout over 18 months, with Omega-7 serving as the coordination center for territorial development reviews. Lyaria moved to stand beside him at the observation windows, her presence bringing the familiar warmth that had somehow survived 5 years of separation and 6 months of intensive diplomacy. "Captain Chen, you've just helped establish the framework for peaceful coexistence that could last for centuries." "We helped establish it," David corrected. "Though I still think the breakthrough came when you realized that territorial disputes are fundamentally the same as marriage counseling on a galactic scale. Your insight, not mine. I just scaled up the techniques you taught me about finding solutions that give everyone what they actually need rather than what they think they want." Lyaria's smile carried the kind of shared understanding that had originally drawn them together. The Rigelians didn't really want exclusive control over mineral-rich systems, they wanted guaranteed access to resources for their manufacturing networks. The humans didn't need isolated settlements, they needed communities that could maintain their cultural independence while participating in larger economic systems. David watched the various fleets preparing to depart Omega-7, their missions shifting from potential military action to coordinated development planning. And the Zentauran Confederacy gets integrated territorial networks that maintain collective decision-making while accommodating individual species' needs. Everyone gets what they actually wanted, and nobody has to compromise their fundamental values. Lyaria consulted her personal communicator, checking the status of various implementation committees. "David, the Colonial Administration has offered you the position of Regional Coordinator for Territorial Development. Full ambassadorial status, permanent assignment to Omega-7, and authority to oversee the implementation of the new accords. That's quite a step up from Station Administrator. It's also quite a step toward the kind of work you were meant to be doing." Managing supply schedules and mediating trader disputes never used your real talents. Lyaria's voice carried the harmonics that indicated deep emotional resonance. Besides, the position comes with some interesting fringe benefits. Such as close collaboration with the Zentauran Confederacy's diplomatic corps. Regular consultation with the Supreme Commander on territorial integration matters. And living quarters aboard the flagship of the most advanced fleet in known space. Lyaria's expression grew serious. If you want them. David considered the offer while watching the organized chaos of departing delegations coordinate their exit from Omega-7 space. The past 6 months had demonstrated that he and Lyaria worked remarkably well together as diplomatic partners, combining his understanding of human psychology with her strategic vision and political authority. Their professional collaboration had been more successful than either of them had dared hope. The personal aspects of their reunion had been more complicated, involving careful negotiation of boundaries, honest discussions about the failures that had ended their marriage, and the gradual recognition that they'd both grown into people who might be capable of building something stronger than what they'd lost. They hadn't rushed back into romance, but they'd rediscovered the intellectual and emotional compatibility that had originally attracted them to each other. What about the Supreme Commander's personal life? David asked. Doesn't running a military confederation make relationship maintenance somewhat challenging? It makes it complicated, Lyaria admitted. But I've discovered that having a partner who understands both the political pressures and the strategic implications of my decisions makes the job considerably more manageable. She moved closer, her voice dropping to the intimate tone she used for conversations meant only for him. David, I've spent 5 years building an empire, and I've learned that power without someone to share it with is just elaborate loneliness. And you think we can avoid the mistakes that destroyed our marriage the first time? I think we're both different people now, with different strengths and a better understanding of what we actually need from each other. Lyaria looked directly at him with the kind of intensity that had once made him feel like the center of the universe. I also think that the work we're doing together, building frameworks for peaceful coexistence between different species, might be more important than our individual concerns about relationship complications. David watched a draconian heavy cruiser execute a perfect departure maneuver, its crew having spent the past month learning to coordinate with species they'd considered potential enemies just half a year ago. The success of the Omega Accords had proven that even the most fundamental conflicts could be resolved through creative compromise and genuine understanding of what each party actually valued. All right, David said, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I'll accept the position. But I want my own office, my own staff, and the right to disagree with the Supreme Commander when I think she's making strategic mistakes. Granted, Lyaria replied immediately. Though I reserve the right to ignore your disagreements when I think you're being overly cautious about necessary risks. Fair enough. David turned to face her fully. And personally, I'd like to see if the people we've become can build something better than what we had before. No rushing, no unrealistic expectations, just honest effort to understand each other and shared commitment to making it work. Lyaria's smile carried both vulnerability and determination. What do you think, David? Ready for another adventure in impossible relationship dynamics? David looked at his ex-wife, who had somehow become the most powerful diplomatic figure in 3 sectors while he'd been hiding on a frontier station, and realized that the universe's sense of irony had brought them both exactly where they needed to be. I think, he said, that if we can negotiate peace between 14 alien species, we might be able to figure out how to make a relationship work between 2 humans who actually care about each other. Even when one of those humans commands a battle fleet. Especially when one of those humans commands a battle fleet. Someone has to keep you grounded when the power goes to your head. Lyaria laughed, the sound carrying harmonics that made David remember all the reasons he'd fallen in love with her originally. In that case, Regional Coordinator Chen, welcome aboard the ZCS Harmony. Your quarters are ready, your office has been configured to your specifications, and your first briefing on sector-wide territorial development is scheduled for tomorrow morning. What about tonight? Tonight, I thought we might have dinner together and discuss the philosophical implications of building a relationship between two people whose idea of small talk involves preventing interstellar wars. Lyaria's expression grew soft with the kind of affection that had survived 5 years of separation and 6 months of careful professional collaboration. Just the two of us, no diplomatic protocols, no strategic implications. Just dinner and conversation like we used to have. David considered the offer while watching the last of the alien delegations depart from Omega-7, their missions transformed from potential conflict to cooperative development. In the distance, he could see his former station continuing its operations under new management, its role expanded from simple way station to coordination center for galactic territorial accords. Dinner sounds perfect, David said. But I'm choosing the wine. Supreme Commanders have terrible taste in vintage selection. Former Supreme Commanders who've just negotiated the largest diplomatic agreement in galactic history are allowed to have questionable taste in wine, Lyaria replied. Besides, I seem to remember that your idea of fine dining involves anything that doesn't come from a replicator. Shows what you know. I've developed quite sophisticated culinary standards during my years of station administration. Such as, I can tell the difference between synthetic coffee and the really good synthetic coffee. Lyaria's laughter filled the observation deck with warmth that had nothing to do with the ship's environmental systems. David Chen, you are exactly the kind of sophisticated diplomat that galactic civilization needs. As they walked toward Lyaria's private dining area, David reflected on how his quiet morning routine 6 months ago had been shattered by the arrival of his ex-wife and her army. The comfortable isolation he'd built on Omega-7 had been replaced by a life that involved preventing wars, negotiating with alien civilizations, and rebuilding a relationship with someone who commanded enough military power to reshape entire sectors. It was considerably more complex than managing cargo schedules and atmospheric readings, but David had to admit it was also considerably more fulfilling. Especially when it came with the possibility of sharing quiet dinners with someone who understood both the strategic implications of galactic politics and his preference for real coffee over synthetic alternatives. Lyaria, he said as they settled into the comfortable chairs of her private dining area, for the record, this is much better than my morning coffee routine. For the record, she replied, her smile carrying 5 years of missed conversations and 6 months of renewed partnership. This is exactly the kind of adventure I was hoping to share when I decided to bring an entire battle fleet to ask my ex-husband for help preventing a war. As the stars wheeled past the observation windows and the ship's systems hummed with the quiet efficiency of advanced technology, David realized that sometimes the best relationships were built not on avoiding complications, but on finding partners who made even the most impossible complications feel like opportunities for shared adventure. Even if those complications occasionally involved commanding fleets, preventing interstellar wars, and learning to negotiate with species whose idea of diplomatic protocol involved ceremonial combat rituals. But that, David thought as he watched Lyaria coordinate the ship's operations with casual competence, was a small price to pay for the kind of partnership that could prevent wars and build frameworks for galactic peace. Besides, it definitely made for more interesting dinner conversation than atmospheric sensor calibrations.